Hello my bookish friends out there in booktube land, and welcome to a rather special episode of Tristan and the Classics, because in this video, in honour of Victober, I thought I'd share with you 10 lesser known, even you could say obscure, Victorian authors and authoresses. So without further ado, let's have a quick look through them, shall we? So in case you don't know what Victober is, it's a semi-reading challenge where in the month of October you try and read at least one Victorian classic from an English author or authoress. So I say English to say British really. So English, Scottish, Welsh, Irish. And if you go over to, I think it's Lucy in the Reader, her channel, she and two other booktubers set up Victober last year, and they give you sort of a challenge of what kind of book to read this year, normally 3 books in the month of October. But for a lot of you lovely people who are so kind as to subscribe to my channel, I know a lot of you are already quite broadly, widely read. And so if you're doing Victober, you may not want to be looking at your Brontes and your Gaskells and your Eliots and your Dickens and your Thackeray's and your Collins. You might just want to find something from the Victorian period by a writer that you may never even have heard of before. And so I'm going to give you 5 women, 5 men, and see if you've actually heard of any of them or read any of their works, and please comment below if you have and what you thought of them. So here goes. Our first authoress is called Catherine Gore, and she was none other than the daughter of a wine merchant, would you believe? Now, Catherine Gore actually writes quite a number of novels. I think it's in around at least 30 novels that she wrote. And you would say she was amongst the best known silver fork writers. I've talked about silver fork writing pertaining to Disraeli in another video in this channel. But silver fork writing is basically where the middle class and even the lower classes get to read stories of those in high society, Regency England, normally. And Catherine Gore specialises in that. A little bit of voyeurism into the stately rooms and salons of the hoi polloi. Her first book, The Broken Hearts, which certainly smacks of a certain romanticism sounding in the title, was actually published in 1828, which is in the Regency period. So this is not only a writer of silver fork novels, but it's someone who has lived during the Regency period. So it's Georgette Eyre, if you like her, but actually living in the Regency period. And she writes her novels all the way through to 1858, where I believe her last book was called Heckington. Makes you wonder whether she wanted to start it off with the words, what the, which would have made a great title, What the Heckington. So there we have our first authoress, Catherine Gore, the wine merchant's daughter, who wrote silver fork novels. Have you read anything by her? Have you even heard of her? Now our next author is a chap who lived at the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century. And if you like science fiction, you might be interested in this chap, although he didn't only write sci-fi, he wrote adventures as well, and even a bit of romance. But his name's Richard Cromie, or Cromie, C-R-O-M-I-E. Put it on the screen here, and I'll probably put a picture of him somewhere around here. Richard Cromie was the son of a doctor. And you've got to remember, at the end of the 19th century, modernity is arising as we begin to know it. The reaching out of the Industrial Revolution, going forward into the future and its possibilities, is starting to be explored. And you'll have characters like Jules Verne at this time, and characters who will come just a tad later in the form of H.G. Wells will be coming. Well, Cromie comes before Wells. He's a contemporary of Verne. In fact, Verne liked Cromie's work. He praised him. Now, some of the work that Cromie did was a plunge into space. So actually going into space itself, seeing that adventure, so sci-fi. And this was 10 years before The First Men in the Moon by H.G. Wells himself. If I'm right, I think in this plot, a group of people go off to Mars where a Martian creeps aboard ship, and they've only got enough air and the like to last for the crew, not one extra person. And so there's some kind of dilemma that starts. So I don't know the book well, but that's one of his famous ones. On top of that, Cromie seems to have a startlingly good imagination, because there's a book he writes called The Crack of Doom, or The Cracked Doom, in which is the first depiction, and I think we're talking 1900 here, maybe even earlier, the first depiction of an atomic explosion. So clearly he could see where science was headed, its potentialities. And maybe due to his affiliation with his father, he also writes a book called The Romance of Poisons, or Poisoning, and this came out in a series in one of the magazines of the day, and it basically picked up, based on truth, the toxicology reports of how certain people were killed and how it was worked out how they'd been killed, and resolving the murder, as it were. And so in that sense, you could say Cromie, not only is he a forerunner for the sci-fi genre, but in that book, he gives us the first forensic pathologist in literature, or at least the first forensic toxicologist in literature. So this guy, whom I have never read, I might add, seems to have some very cutting-edge ideas up his sleeve. So there you are, the second one, Richard Cromie. Our next authoress is Charlotte Mary Yonge. Now this prolific writer wrote no less than 160 novels. I mean, that outdoes P.G. Wodehouse, who just never stopped writing at all. I mean, that is an insane amount of writing that Yonge has done. And I think it was her second novel, which was called The Heir of Redcliffe, was one of the most popular novels of the entire 19th century. I think the most sold piece of literature in the 19th century was Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. But The Heir of Redcliffe may well be second in line for the 19th century. It left Dickens and Thackeray in the dust, according to J.B. Priestley. So that's quite some accolade to have to your name. She writes a fair amount of romance, love, peril. She makes observations of life in her day, and she does historical novels as well, because one of her books is called The Armourer's Prentices and is set in Henry VIII's Tudor England. And you must remember that Romanticism, of course, is a big movement before the Victorian age, and you would already have Sir Walter Scott producing historical novels like Ivanhoe, for instance. And so it's no surprise to find that there would be some great women writers of the day also bringing out historical novels. So that was our next authoress, Charlotte Mary Yonge. Our next author is one William Clark Russell. Now, William Clark Russell spent a lot of years at sea in the Merchant Navy, and anyone that seems to have spent any length of time at sea becomes addicted to the atmosphere and environment, the romance, the peril, the solitude and the silence that the ocean brings. And you get quite a number of people who have been to sea who turn into authors, and William Clark Russell was one of them. He was also a journalist after being in the Merchant Navy, so really honed his craft in how to keep people's attention with his writing. And naturally, his writings revolve around nautical journeys and nautical escapades. He's a very much the Patrick O'Brian of his day, writing daring do on the high seas. But not only that, his work also had deeper messages. His work actually caused reform in the Merchant Navy, because the Merchant Navy obviously is for profit, not just for national security like the Royal Navy. And so just to make, a quick earning or the highest profits, the merchants who had the ships and sent them out to go around the world used to send the most horrible provisions for the crew to live on, the most basic, primitive provisions and the most primitive quarters for them to live on, so that they could pack as much cargo as they possibly could. Of course, this would cause people to either lose their lives or severely shorten their lives just for the sake of profit. In fact, I think it was King George V that even pointed out the influence of Russell in causing these reforms. Amongst his books are An Ocean Tragedy, which I believe you can get on Kindle. And in this you've got a fellow whose wife runs away with a dashing Portuguese fellow on a Portuguese sloop. And not content to let her run off, her husband sets sail to track them down. Of course, they sort of meet in the seas, and there's a bit of a showdown, and the Portuguese man's fitted out his sloop with a great big cannon, which of course is going to be dangerous. Now, as love affairs go, I've been told that Russell is not the greatest love writer. However, he is second to none when describing the sea and being on a boat and understanding the life of people that went to sea. His most famous work was The Wreck of the Grosvenor, which was written about 100 years after the actual wreck of the Grosvenor. And it's basically the story of a group of sailors who travel from England to South America, but they're very roguish and mutinous, and there's a lot of grumbling on board and danger and storm. And then they come across a ship that is in trouble at sea. And there's a dilemma for the captain, especially considering the state of his crew, about doing the moral thing or doing his duty, and what will happen. And that apparently is Russell's most famous work, The Wreck of the Grosvenor. Now, the next authoress that I'm going to mention is somebody whom I definitely will be reading as soon as I can, and in particular, one piece of work. And that is Mary Kingsley. That's the niece of Charles Kingsley, author of Water Babies, set in Clovelly down in Cornwall. Mary Kingsley went to Africa, West Africa specifically, with her father who worked there, and he wrote down many an account of the things he saw and wanted to bring attention to situations over there in West Africa, but he died too early. Mary Kingsley carries on her travels in West Africa a lot of the time by herself. And what she's got here is not only a travel log, but she says she wrote it in the form of an epic, an exciting, rip-roaring tale to keep people's interest, because she had something very particular she wanted to accomplish, and that was to draw attention to the lives of the natives in the colonies and what British imperialism was doing and what it was about. She takes aim at the evangelical missionaries who storm into Africa and try and disrupt the religious practices of its native people, or try to force a religion upon them rather than just persuading them. She develops the characters that she meets sympathetically as human beings, not subordinate to the English or to the French or Portuguese or who else is trying to grow an empire in Africa. Of course, I haven't read it all, but I'd expect that there are going to be some things today we may not like. Maybe not all of her opinions will be to our taste. However, she was highlighting the problem of imperialism, colonialism. In fact, I believe Mary Kingsley later, if I've got this right now, she was a nurse in the Boer Wars, which took place in Africa. And so she was one intrepid explorer. Nothing fazed this woman. She did more than most people ever will in her life, and sadly died of typhus because she got infected towards the end of the Boer War, actually, while in a hospital. The book that she wrote, and I think she wrote more than one, but this is the one to look for, is simply called Travels in West Africa. So how does that sound to you? It's travel writing with the zhuzh and pizzazz of an epic thriller, but it's all true. Next up is a writer who started producing his works smack bang in the middle of the 19th century and running sort of from the latter end of the 1840s to the 1870s, and that was the Scottish novelist and writer James Hannay, not related to Richard Hannay of the 39 Steps. I couldn't find a great deal of information on this writer, except that he's produced quite a number of works and quite varied as well. His background too was in the Navy, and so when you get a book entitled Biscuits and Grog, you can imagine that it's a naval story. And I think the majority of his books touch on that, his novels that is. He does a number of histories, somewhat obscure histories pertaining to certain families, which probably won't be everyone's cup of tea. In fact, they're very niche, to be quite honest. But also, James Hannay, although not the most famous of novelists, was apparently a brilliant reader and a great critic of works. And so towards the end of his writing career, he writes a course in English literature, which I believe you can still get hold of for free from various colleges around the world in PDF format. I certainly will be looking at that. He also does critiques of various writers, various books, various genres, notably satire. So that's James Hannay. Have you ever heard of him? Have you ever read any of his books? The one I mentioned, Biscuits and Grog, was actually his first book. He did plenty of novels after that, but it seems the longer he went on, he moved towards more non-fiction works. Although don't take that as gospel, because like I say, I couldn't find a massive amount of detail on this author, but he's written enough anyway to hunt him out. The next authoress that we're going to talk about really takes my fancy. Her name is Amy Levy, or Levy, and she was classed as a new woman. I don't know if you're aware of this term towards the latter end of the 19th century. It's what essentially we would term a feminist, before feminism was literally a movement. She was very much for women's suffrage and for men's suffrage too. This is a thing that's often forgotten. People think that all men had the vote for centuries and only women had it recently. I believe men only got universal suffrage something like 30 years before women did. So Amy Levy wanted fairness in society. She didn't like the strictures of society on women. The sort of uselessness, the very impracticality of the way women were dressed at this time was something that was under attack by the New Woman movement. The use of bicycles by women, could you believe, was a big radical issue. And the bicycle as we know it in its form actually has its roots with the New Woman, because it was easier to ride than a penny farthing if you were dressed in all that garb. And the simplifying of women's clothing came about partly because of the use of the bicycle, which made women independent. They could travel further. Amy Levy wanted women to be able to be independent of thought, independent of the husband having all of the money, going and doing more male traditional roles in working. And this finds its way out in some of her works. The one that particularly takes my fancy is called The Romance of a Shop, which, not the most grabby title, I wouldn't say, but maybe at the day it was. It's the story of some sisters whose father has left them in poverty, and they decide to start a business. And what business is it? It's a photography shop. So not only is it a shop, it's quite cutting edge as well, photography. And how they go about integrating into society and making their way, establishing themselves as a legitimate business against the critical eyes of the society, the majority of society of its day, as these women shouldn't be doing what is traditionally a man's role. And I don't know how this story pans out at all, but I love the setting. And this is really the critical period of societal change regarding women in the workplace. It's this period that everything begins to change towards the suffragette movement. So that's one of her works. Another of her works, which you can get hold of quite easily, is Reuben Sachs, which is printed by Persephone Books. Reuben Sachs, this isn't a feminist book, it's not the New Woman, but it shows Amy Levy's focus on unbalance of society. And this book itself focuses on the tension in Jewish-Anglo relations. I don't mean Israel and Britain. I'm talking about Anglo-Jews who live in Britain. How do people react to the Jewish community being within society. Again, I don't know any more about the book, but that certainly sounds my cup of tea. And this woman, when you read more of her, as I did, trawling around the internet for various bits and pieces, she really was quite something. Our next author is a fellow called Sir Max Pemberton. I mean, there's a quality aristocratic name. There's Sir Max Pemberton. This chap focuses on mystery and intrigue and action. It seems, from what I looked of his books, that basically anything that can be exciting, no matter where it takes place or what walk of life it's in, Max Pemberton has a go at it. And some people, he didn't get rave reviews at all times. Other people really liked his work. He was popular in his own day, but heavily criticised later. One of the books that really titillates my imagination is a short one called Jewel Mysteries I Have Known. And apparently this is a group of case studies of literal jewel thefts or jewel crimes and how they've been solved. From what I've inspected about this book, it's not classic whodunit. It doesn't ring your noggin trying to work out how the crime could have been committed. It's relatively straightforward, but it's all taken from real examples. And jewel theft as a mystery genre was not as big then. Murder is the obvious mystery. Of course, you have got Wilkie Collins done the Moonstone, which all revolves around a jewel. But this is all based on facts, and I just like the idea of that Victorian eclecticism. Other works that he's done involve The Little Huguenot, which is set in the period of the Musketeers of France. So whether he was influenced by Dumas, I do not know, but that's an exciting time period, and there's political intrigue and wily women and savage men involved in that. And his most famous work is called The Iron Pirate. So we're set in a totally different arena once again. So there you are, Sir Max Pemberton, writer of mysteries, intrigue and adventure. Just sort of nothing classic with a big C, but just a roaring yarn, to be quite honest. Have you heard of someone called Ouida? O-U-I-D-A, bit like Ouija for Ouija board, but this is Ouida. It's the nom de plume of an authoress called Marie-Louise Ramée. Born in England, died in Italy, I think in the sort of near Lecce. And she's got a beautiful sort of sarcophagus gravestone, which you can go and see to this day. Ouida, if that's how you pronounce it, wrote over 40 works of literature, novels, which is, again, a stupendous amount of work. Okay, so it's not the same as Mary Young's 160 novels or Mary Elizabeth Braddon's 81 novels, but 40 novels, which means if you read Ouida's works and like them, there's plenty of them to carry on reading with. Something that's very alluring about Marie-Louise Ramée is that she used to hold soirees, even though she didn't make loads of money from her literature, but she mixed with the likes of Robert Browning and Oscar Wilde and Swinburne. So she's in a very good company, and to have people like that reading your literature and advising you on how to develop the plots, she must have been pretty good, to be quite honest. Her most famous work is called Under Two Flags. A great title, actually. What it's about is a British aristocrat who has sort of got himself into debt and wants to get himself out of debt, but he's sort of outed as being in trouble. And to spare the reputation of people related to him, so he fakes his own death and heads off to Algeria, where he joins the French Foreign Legion. And what you then see in the book is this relationship between, one, a Britishman amongst the French, but it's the French and the Algerian population. And apparently there's a little bit of sort of cliched self-sacrifice that goes on in the book, but very much worth a read, and one that will really engage you and actually grab the attention of the modern Victorian public. Have you ever heard of Ouida and her books? I can honestly say I did, but I can also honestly say I've never read any of them. So I feel I need to put that right, because that was a name you would have known at the latter end of the 19th century if you were reading the stories that came out in the magazines and the papers. And that brings us to our final author of these 10 authors who you may never have heard of before. And that is someone called William Black. Not William Blake, William Black. William Black was very, very popular as a novelist in his own time. He was compared with, and even thought by some to be better than, Thackeray. Now, if you're considered better than Thackeray, or even equal to Thackeray, well, but that puts you in the same stratosphere of Dickens, because Dickens and Thackeray, although Dickens slightly edged him in merit, apparently, Dickens and Thackeray are the two that are often classed with each other. And yet William Black wrote so well as to be considered better than Thackeray. And yet hardly anyone knows of him now. His work sort of died out in the mid-20th century. He actually wrote 20 novels. So again, it's one of those, if you enjoy what he writes, you're going to be able to find plenty more of it, although you will have to scour around like archive.org for these out-of-print things that you need to get on PDF form. But his stories seem again to take in a sweep of life from what I was reading about him. So he does some stories which talk about theatre life, not just a ramble about theatres of the day, but setting his characters from the theatre and the world of the theatre, which was the Hollywood of its day, and so naturally that should make a great backdrop for stories. Black also does books on political intrigue. Now, I like political intrigue because it takes a lot of plotting. I love a good plot and the interplay of characters, and you'll always get mystery whenever there is political intrigue in something. One of his books apparently touches on the topic of the use of drugs in Victorian society and their effects on characters. He does stories about love as well, and his most famous one is called Daughter of Heth. And I can only imagine that's taken from the phrase by Rebecca when talking to Isaac about her son Esau in the Bible, where he has taken a daughter of Heth, which was not a good thing. He should have took a wife from his own people, but didn't. Anyway, I don't know how that relates to the book. The story itself sounds absolutely fascinating and brilliant. It seems to be quite a classic love story, tragic love story, where you've got the lovers who are meant to be, but the stars are crossed and things don't align for them, and it all ends in a way that chokes the reader's heart. And it's a bit of a love triangle as well. I don't want to say too much because although I've read up on it, I don't want to give the plot away because I actually know how it ends. So a bit of a gauntlet you run when making a video like this is you're researching things, and often you find out how books end. So, but I really want to read it nonetheless, because if he is as good as they say, Thackeray level, then I have a feeling I will eventually hunt down all of his books. So I hope that you've enjoyed this video on 5 authoresses and 5 authors of the 19th century, specifically Victorian writers, British, Scottish, Irish or Welsh. And have you ever heard of any of them? How many of these authors and authoresses have you heard of? Write down the names of the ones you haven't below. And which of all of the authors that we've talked about here do you find most appealing, and which one do you reckon you'll run out and try to find a copy of? Well, whatever the case may be, I look forward to your answers, and until the next video, I wish you joy in your reading of obscure authors and authoresses.